Thank you for checking out Coastal Community Church. We hope that you receive hope and encouragement through this week's message. If this ministry has impacted your life in any way, please share your story at mystory@coastalcommunity.tv. We hope you enjoy the service.
How are y'all doing this morning? Pompano! Yeah, that's better. All right. Now, I just wanted to make sure. Hey, my name's TJ, in case you don't know, and I'm one of the pastors here. We're glad that you're with us today in this warm theater. I'm just going to go ahead and address it. I don't know why I'm wearing a jacket, but it's cold in Creek, and so we got a jacket here. But I'm glad that you're with us as we're in the second week of this series called Habits of Happiness. And really, this is kind of a bait and switch series on you guys, and the fact that we talked about last week that, you know, happiness is something that's based on the things that are happening in life, where joy is something so much more substantial, that it's something that's based on an internal thing. And we kind of kicked this series off last week, and I gave you some history on the book of Philippians, and I thought it'd be important to kind of remind you of what happened last week in case you weren't here, to catch you up, because we're doing a verse-by-verse study on the book of Philippians. And so if you weren't here last week, the book of Philippians was written by the Apostle Paul. It was written to the church in Philippi, and Paul had actually planted this church. He had started this church, and so he had this deep affinity and love for this community of believers. I mean, he was just passionate about them. He loved seeing what God was doing in their lives, and so he's writing this letter to them from a very, very interesting perspective, because in this letter, as we read through it, or as you read through it on your own, you'll see that the word joy or rejoice is mentioned over 16 times in this book. And so Paul's perspective is he's trying to give us some keys and some elements to how do we have true joy in our life? How do we have this thing that doesn't leave us or forsake us, even in the midst of difficult times in our life? And so you would think that he's writing this from like vacation in the Bahamas or something, like he's on the beach with a Mai Tai, but that's not necessarily the case at all. Paul was actually on mission. He wanted to go be a missionary to Rome. He wanted to win Rome for Christ, and so that was his dream. And so while he was on his way there, he happened to get arrested, and instead of going to Rome as a missionary, he's actually imprisoned and brought to Rome. He's actually sitting in this prison for 2 years, chained up to a Roman soldier, awaiting his execution. And in the middle of that scenario, Paul is writing this letter to the Philippians. He's writing it to the Philippian church, and we see all this encouragement, and we see all this joy, and we see words like rejoice, and you look at those things and you go, man, he was in the middle of some difficult moments. How in the world did he keep that perspective? Like, how do you and I keep the same perspective when we're going through some difficult times? And we talked about last week that happiness is an external thing, where joy is an internal thing. Where happiness is based on something that's happening outside, where joy is based on someone that's on the inside. And the fact that joy is based on this relationship with the creator of the heavens and the universe, Jesus Christ. And it's important for us to understand this. And the reason it's so important for us to understand this is because bad days are going to come in our life. Anybody in here ever experienced a bad day? The majority of us, right? Bad days are coming. Now, I realize some of you are like, well, Pastor TJ, you just need to be more positive in life. You need to have a better perspective. Like, I am positive bad days are coming your way, okay? So I'm going to be positive today. And so, like, I am positive bad days are coming your way. But the good news is the Bible says in Nehemiah, do not grieve. God is saying, don't be upset. For the joy of the Lord is your strength. He's saying there's something that we can have in the midst of our bad days that can give us something more. And this series is a verse-by-verse study to learn how that we can have joy in each and every one of our lives, no matter what the circumstances are. But I also believe that it's really, really important to have fun in church. Anybody like to have fun in church? Like, I like having fun in church. Like, I like making fun of things. I like to make people laugh. I think it's an important thing. Like, I think God likes to have fun. I think he's got a great sense of humor in life. And so I just think that we should be able to embrace that. And God wants us to have this unbelievable joy in our lives. In fact, Jesus said, I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete, in John 15. Because Jesus, more than anything, is he wants that joy that was in his life to be complete in each and every one of us. And the thing that I think that steals the majority of the joy in our life, if there is one element that really, really robs us or is a killjoy, so to say, in our life, would be relational conflict. Like, anytime we have some relational conflict, that relational conflict can suck the joy out of your life so fast. And the Apostle Paul realized this. He understood this. He saw some relational conflict that was going on, and he starts to address this relational conflict. And he says, man, there's actually some attitudes that we can take on that cause the relational conflict to come into our life that rob us of joy. And he actually gives us a couple of examples starting in Philippians chapter 1. And if you're taking notes, he says, man, the first one is this. It's this idea of disunity. This is the idea of disunity. And in verse 1, he says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if you have any comfort from his love, if you have any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being in one spirit and purpose. And so what he's doing is he's saying, listen, it's all about having this same mind. It's about having this same spirit. It's about having this same love. It's about the idea that, man, when we're in unity, there is something powerful that can happen. On the flip side of that, when there isn't unity, it can cause a lot of struggles. And what Paul is addressing right here is some conflict that he actually refers to the people in chapter 4. He refers to these two women. I don't know how to say their names, so I'm going to call them E and S. And so E and S it's kind of like PMS, but it's E and S. Like, it causes problems, relational difficulty. If you're a man living with somebody with that, there's relational difficulty during that time. Like I said, I like church being fun and saying whatever I want, so it's part of my deal. And so we got E and S here, and they've got some conflict going on. And it's causing some disunity. Like, one of the ladies is like, you didn't say that. And she's like, I did. And, and there is this tension going on in the church. And Paul realizes this, and he says, man, there is this disagreement, and we need to get of the same mind and of the same heart. Because all of us have experienced some disagreements with people, haven't we? How many of y'all have had a disagreement with somebody? If you're married, you got like both hands up. You're like, I've experienced a couple of those. We've all experienced some disagreements. And some of us, we create conflict more than others. In fact, I found this story of this woman named Mildred. She happened to be kind of the church gossip of her community, and she felt like it was her business to be in everybody else's business and let everybody else know about their business. Anybody ever met somebody like Mildred in life? And so, like, because Mildred had so much dirt on everybody else, everybody was kind of scared to address her because they were afraid of what she might say about them to somebody else. Well, in this church, they happened to have a new member named George, and George was new to the crew, and so he didn't really have any reputation or anything. But one day, as Mildred was driving by their main street, she saw that George's truck was parked out in front of the one and only town bar. And so she automatically made the assumption that if George's truck is parked in front of the town bar, then that means George must be inside drinking, getting drunk. And so she started telling everybody, we know what you're doing, George. I saw your truck out there, and we all know if your truck's in front of the bar and talking all this junk, and even talking junk to George's face. And George, being a wise man, didn't respond to Mildred at all. He just looked at her. He smiled and he walked away, and everybody else in the church was blown away by the fact that George didn't even address the things that Mildred came up with. And later that night when Mildred went home after her lights went out, George decided to go and park his truck in front of Mildred's house all night long. Now, that isn't the best way to get rid of some discord, but it is one way to address a problem. But we've all met people who are talkers. We've all met some people that are gossipers. And those people, let me just tell you something. If they're talking to you about somebody, they're going to be talking about you to somebody. And every time that starts happening, doesn't matter if it's in a church, in a relationship, in a marriage, it's always going to cause the joy to seep and to dissipate out of that life. And so I just have a fundamental belief, instead of talking about somebody, you need to go talk to somebody. Instead of talking about a person, you need to have a conversation with that person. We have a rule in our house for Shayla and I. Man, if we've got a problem with one another, we don't let that thing fester. We don't talk about it to other people. We talk to each other about that thing. We sit down, we work that junk out, and then we move on. Because anytime you let that stuff fester in your relationship, it is always going to cause disunity. And that conflict is just going to boil up over and over again, and it's going to rob you of joy. And what is the main reason for most of our conflicts? I think James, the brother of Jesus, addresses this in James chapter 4. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? And I don't know about you, but the desire that battles within me most of the time isn't that, like I have the most interesting fight. The thing that battles within me is I just want to be right. Doesn't really matter what I'm arguing about. They can be right. I just want to win. And a lot of us, that's just an internal thing. And Paul is trying to get us to go, man, it's not about you. Decide that and decide to keep the unity when it comes to relationships. Then he addresses another area that causes a lot of our joy to dissipate, and it's this idea of pride. And pride will kill our joy because it forces you to make a judgment about somebody else. And in order to have pride, you got to elevate yourself and you got to decrease somebody else. And anytime there's pride in a relationship, it will always steal your joy. That's why in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, it says this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. There's a couple things there. Vain conceit, I would say that is something that we're living with greatly today. It's this pride rod that a lot of us are on right now. And he says, hey, do nothing that way. He says, but in humility consider who? Other people. He says, consider others better. And that word better there literally means worthy of respect. He says, consider other people worthy of the respect that you want in life. He's like, I want you to take that perspective, put your pride down, and consider them worthy of your respect. The problem is that today we're always comparing ourselves among ourselves. We're always trying to see, well, where do I stand in the pecking order of things? And our society has changed us so much because 10 years ago, we could only do that with 5 or 6 people that were to the left or to the right of us. But because of the impact of social media today, we're not comparing ourselves among ourselves with 5 or 6 people. We're comparing ourselves among ourselves with hundreds and thousands of people. And we're trying to see, where do we rank in the scale of life? Like, how awesome am I or how not awesome am I? And we're ranking ourselves. And I really, really believe that social media is to pride what gasoline is to fire. Man, it will just jack things up. And the problem is that social media is not reality. And a lot of us, we think that social media is people's real lives, but social media, all that it is it's the highlight reel of people's lives. It's not the reality. It doesn't matter whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, it's Instagram, it's Snapchat, it's whatever those things, other social medias I have no idea about. It doesn't really matter. Let's take Instagram, for instance. Because people will go on Instagram and take the most amazing pictures of things. Like let me show you one. I got a couple. Foodies, they go out there and man, they're like, man, I cooked burgers tonight and hand cut French fries, and they'll post this picture right here. That's their Instagram life. But the reality looks like this. They spent 7 hours making one burger look like that, and that's what they ate. Or let's take cats, for instance, or kids. Oh, there's a kid. Like that, isn't that cat adorable? Like that cat, like it's got a hat on. Like how cute is that? But we all know your cat really looks like this. It's straight from the devil. Like there's no cat is cute. That's Satan's animal right there, and so, Or let's take little kids, like your kid, he's painting, like what, first of all, what parent lets their kid paint in a white shirt, first of all? And like the suspenders with the checkers and everything's within the lines. You post that on social media. My kid is awesome at painting, when this is what your kid looks like after painting. Like, I love social media. I love keeping up with what's going on with people's lives, but anytime you start comparing your life with somebody else's life, you start to lose. And there is no win in comparison. And comparison is the thief of joy. And comparison always leads to pride. And the problem is that you'll always find somebody that you're better than, but you'll also always find somebody that's better than you. And it's a killer when it comes to relationships. That's why in Proverbs it says that a man's pride brings him low. Like when we get pride in our life, it just sucks us down. Then Paul says another area that just destroys your joy in relationships is just selfishness. When we become selfish in life, when we focus on our wants and our needs, and when it becomes all about me. That's why he says in verse 4, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. He says it's not, listen, you can look to your life, and it's okay to have interests on your own, but if all of your interests are all about you, then you're not ever looking to the interests of others, and you're living an extremely selfish life. And how you know you're living an extremely selfish life is if you're helping someone and expecting something in return, you're doing business with them, you're not doing kindness. Now, some of y'all need to get that. When you're doing something for someone and you're expecting something in return, you're doing business with that person. You're not going out there and being selfless and being kind to them. And Paul says, man, we got to change these attitudes. And so what Paul is getting us to see is he's saying, listen, there's a different attitude and there is a different way. And in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, he says this, your attitude should be the same of that as Jesus Christ. And he says, listen, if you want to have this joy in your relationships, if you want to get rid of the relational conflict in your world, that there are some attitudes that you're going to have to change. There's some things that you're going to have to do. And when I say these things, you're going to go like, I don't believe it, but I challenge you to live these things out this week and see what happens, because Paul talks about how Jesus modeled his life and his attitude. And then at the end, he gives us this personal example of what he was experiencing. And so if you're taking notes, number one there in your notes, if we're going to take on the attitude that Jesus had, number one, you've got to give up your rights. You've got to give up your rights. In verse 6, it says, talking about Jesus, it says, who being in the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. And so he goes and he says, listen, this whole idea of equality, which we love right now, everybody needs to be equal. He says, listen, if you're going to take the attitude of Christ, equality, meaning you have rights, you've got to get rid of that mindset. Like, you don't have rights. You have responsibilities as a Christ follower. And Jesus, who had the ultimate responsibility of being part of the Godhead, what he did is he said, man, I'm not going to hold on to being God anymore, but I'm going to open up and I'm going to release that out of my hands. He says, I'm not going to grasp that anymore. I'm going to let go of that. And what we see, that as Jesus lowered himself in life, he elevated everyone around him. And I think the same thing is true for us when we start to lower ourselves in life and go, well, you know what? I'm going to give up my rights. I'm going to give up my roles. I'm going to give up my title. I'm going to give up all of that stuff. And I'm going to start to elevate others. Man, it starts to make an impact in everyone else's life. And Paul goes, man, I've been doing this. If you skip ahead to verse 17, he says, but even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on a sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I'm glad and will rejoice with you all. Paul is saying, man, listen, you can't make me mad. You can't steal my joy because I've already lost my life. Like, I've already given up my rights in life. He's saying the same thing he said in Galatians 2:20. Man, I'm crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. He said, my rights are gone. And when you and I, when we give up our rights, nothing can make you angry. Nothing can steal your joy, because a dead man can't get angry. He can't get depressed. He can't be jealous because he's not holding on to any of those rights. He's given them up. And the things that used to cause all that all of a sudden start to dissipate in your life because you have given up this illusion of control that we all love. Thinking that, man, I can control the circumstances. When the reality is when we give up our life, it's when we truly find it. I'm experiencing this right now. I love to CrossFit right now. And so the first rule of CrossFit is to talk about it. Okay, 3 of you know that. Okay, so I haven't informed you all enough. The first rule of CrossFit is you got to talk about CrossFit all the time. And so I absolutely love it. I'm addicted to it, and I've been doing it for about 8 months now, and besides Shayla and Jesus, it's stolen my heart. Like, it's like, besides working and spending time with Jesus and eating some food and spending time with my wife, all I want to do is go to the gym and work out. And so there's some pros to that, and there's some cons to that. The pros to that is I work out a lot. The cons to that is I don't have any clue what I'm doing. And so I started a couple weeks ago. I had this guy come and say, hey, I would like to coach you, and I would like to spend some time and work on some things, and here's what I need. I need you to do everything that I tell you to do. And I don't know about you, but I do like control. Like, I like to be in charge. It's my spiritual gift. I like to be in charge. And so that's hard for me. Like, I like to dictate things. I like to dictate terms. I like to do all that stuff because that's natural. I love control. But I also realize that in my control, I have tons of limitations. And so I decided, you know what, I'm gonna lose control here, and I'm gonna do whatever this guy named Tarzan says, because anybody that has the name Tarzan, I don't know who gave him that name. They're just cool, okay? And so they must know something. And so for the last couple of weeks, man, every day I walk into our CrossFit box, I go, what am I supposed to do? He tells me exactly what I'm supposed to do, and I just go do it. And I'll tell you what, I've failed at more things, but I've also accomplished more things in these last couple of weeks with him controlling my workout life than I've ever experienced before. Why? Because there's freedom in releasing control to accomplish things that you could never accomplish while you're trying to take control of your life. That's why Jesus told us in Luke 17, whoever tries to keep his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will preserve it. And Paul's trying to get us to realize that, man, there is this freedom and this joy that comes from losing control and giving that control over to Jesus. And we start to give up our rights. Then what happens is, number 2, we got to serve somebody. We have got to serve somebody. In verse 7 it says, but he made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And what's the nature of a servant? It's constantly being on the lookout to meet and serve other people. It's looking for their needs and their wants. And that's exactly who Jesus was and what his life was all about. And Paul realized that there was a young man in his life that was the same way. And Paul loved to brag on Timothy, who was his kind of spiritual son, because he had this same philosophy as Jesus. He was just a servant. This is what it says in verse 20. It says, I have no one else like Timothy who takes a genuine interest in your welfare. That genuine interest in your welfare is this idea that he's taken on the very nature of a servant. He's looking for opportunities to make their fare, well, the way that they're living, better. And I started thinking about this in a couple of weeks ago. We were at the cash and carry is it cash and carry or Winn-Dixie that's by our house? Winn-Dixie. I can't ever remember these stores. We were at this Winn-Dixie, and for some reason, Shayla and I were checking out of two different checkout lines. She went to like the place where you have a cashier and you can talk to somebody, and I thought it would be quicker to go through the self-checkout. How many of y'all know that self-checkout is not the fastest way? There should never be a self-checkout thing, because computer illiterate people, we struggle with it. Like, why isn't it scanning? Why won't it take? And so it took me forever to get through my self-checkout, and when I finally did, Shayla was waiting there with the cart, and I started putting the bags of groceries in our cart, and there was this elderly woman that was behind me, and she tapped me after I put the stuff in the cart. She tapped me on my back, and she goes, are you the bag boy? And I'm like, and I just looked at this elderly woman at this computer, like she's like a cow at a Newgate. She had no clue what was going on, and I was like, "Ma'am, I'm your bag boy." And so I walk her through the 20 minutes of her figuring out this thing, and I bag her groceries, and I'm like, "Can I take these groceries for you?" And she's like, "Oh no, but here's a tip." And I'm like, "Ma'am, we don't accept tips here at Winn-Dixie." And I remember walking out of there and just going, man, that was awesome. Like, I loved helping that lady. I loved being her bag boy. That's the only person I'm ever going to be a bag boy for. And I just thought to myself, why am I not looking for opportunities like that all the time? Why am I not looking for opportunities to continuously serve people and try to make that happen for them? Because it brought me so much joy. Like, I had fun working at Winn-Dixie for the first time ever. Not that I'd ever worked there before. That was my first and only, but it was awesome. Because what Paul was trying to get us to get to is this place where, number 3, that you live for the good of others. Where you're living for their good. And in verse 8, he says, "And being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross." And sometimes you can read that and you can say, well, that sounds terrible, death. But when you start to think about the fact that he died for you so that you could live for him, it becomes way greater. You start to realize that Jesus was all about living for others. And later on in the chapter, Paul references another guy that's in the church in Philippi named Aphroditus. In verse 29 and 30, it says, "And welcome what is called me in the Lord with great joy, and honor men like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help that you could not give me." So he was risking his life. He was putting his life to the side because he realized that his life was all about living for other people. It's all about others. And my challenge for all of us is, as people that are following Christ, that are pursuing joy in our life, we need to be somebody who makes everybody feel like a somebody. Because we're not living for our applause. We're not living for our recognition. We're living for others. That's why Jesus said, "Greater love has no man than this, that he'd lay down his life for his friends." That he'd lay it down, that he would serve other people. And I love this quote by C.S. Lewis that I wrote down this morning. It says, "Don't shine so others can see you. Shine so that through you, others can see him shine." See, your joy is to shine, not just so that you can have joy in life, but it's to shine so that others can see God shining through your life. Maybe today that's been difficult because there's been some relational conflict that's been happening in your life. There's been some disunity. There's maybe been some pride on your part or pride on another person's parts. And part of the reason you can't resolve that pride is because you're selfish and you want to be right, or they're selfish and they want to be right. And maybe today's the day that we need to change some of those attitudes. We need to repent of those things and allow God to come into our hearts and come into our life. And we need to give up our rights. And we got to start serving those people rather than expecting something from them, realizing that it's all about living for their good and so that we can shine, so God's joy can shine through you and I.
Thank you for checking out Coastal Community Church. We hope that you receive hope and encouragement through this week's message. If this ministry has impacted your life in any way, please share your story at mystory@coastalcommunity.tv. We hope you enjoy the service.